Hi, my name is Joe, and I'm one of the pastors at Redeemer Lincoln Square. Let me read for you today's passage, which comes from Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 1 to 13. When the Lord your God cuts off the nations whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them, and dwell in their cities and in their houses, you shall set apart 3 cities for yourselves in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall measure the distances and divide into 3 parts the area of the land that the Lord your God gives you as a possession, so that any manslayer can flee to them. This is the provision for the manslayer, who by fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, he may flee to one of these cities and live, lest the avenger of blood in hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him fatally, though the man did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. Therefore I command you, you shall set apart 3 cities. And if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he has sworn to your fathers, and gives you all the land that he promised to give to your fathers, provided you are careful to keep all this commandment which I command you today, by loving the Lord your God and by walking ever in his ways, then you shall add 3 other cities to these 3, lest innocent blood be shed in your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, and so the guilt of bloodshed be upon you. But if anyone hates his neighbor, and lies in wait for him, and attacks him, and strikes him fatally so that he dies, and he flees into one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and take him from there, and hand him over to the avenger of blood, so that he may die. Your eyes shall not pity him, but you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, so that it may be well with you. Amen. Now, what this passage is talking about really is giving due process, granting due process for everybody who's been suspected or convicted of a crime. And so here in this passage, we see that it's specifically in the crime of manslaughter versus murder, and how they are to be treated differently. And what we find here is the provisions that are made for these people who have been suspected of committing a crime, either of manslaughter or of murder. And what we find is that the people of God are to designate, these cities of refuge in their territory. And what's interesting is we find in verse 8 is that even as their territory grows, they are to continue to make provisions for these people by permanently basically adding these cities of refuge as part of their development plan, for their territories. And the reason for that, as we see in verse 6, is that if they were to try and flee to these cities of refuge, if there are too few of them in this large territory that they're about to have, it may take a long time for them to get there and cover great distances. And by the time they reach these cities, these people that were looking for revenge might have caught up with them and have killed them themselves. And so what we find in this passage is that even these people who were considered to be criminals were to be treated with respect, with great respect. And while they take refuge in these cities, what we find is that in verse 12, we see that the elders of the city, how are they to determine whether these people have committed the crime of manslaughter or murder? They were to have an investigation. And so while this investigation is taking place, these people were to be protected. And so again, we see great care and concern for even criminals, people who have been suspected or convicted of crimes that they committed. And what I find really interesting is the level of respect that they are given. And so what's the reason for all of this? We find in verse 10 and verse 13, there's this great concern for innocent blood being shed in the land of God's people. Innocent blood being shed. And so what we find is that with the initial taking of an innocent life, whether it happened intentionally or unintentionally, there was blood that was shed. And all of these measures that were to be taken were taken so that there isn't more innocent blood that is shed as a result of this initial act of taking a person's life. And that's what I find interesting. There's this great concern for blood, for innocent blood that is shed in the land of the people. And that's why there's great care that's being taken to protect these people who have committed these crimes. And I see this, and I see it being so applicable today, right? This call to do everything that we can to keep innocent blood from being shed in our land. Now, some of the direct application that we can think about in terms of today can be in the way we think about a criminal justice system, right? How do we treat those who have been suspected of committing these crimes, or even convicted of having committed these crimes? Do we treat them with the same level of respect and give them, afford them the due process that were given to the people in the nation of Israel? Right? That's one immediate application that I can think about. But there's another one where, and it's more broadly speaking, we're given a reminder that the kingdom that Jesus is bringing, right, and that he began to bring, right, by shedding his own innocent blood on the cross, that he continues to bring, that will be consummated upon his return, what we find is it's a just kingdom, where every single judgment that is doled out, that is given out to the people, will be one in which where nobody will be able to look at and say that was an unjust judgment. Every judgment that is doled out by the great judge that is Jesus Christ will be just. There will be no question left as to whether it was a right judgment or not. But until that time comes, there's a call, I believe, for God's people. It's a call for God's people to do everything that they can to make sure that there isn't innocent blood that is shed in our midst. Right? It's a societal responsibility, because what we find in verse 10 is that if there is innocent blood that is shed in the land, the guilt of bloodshed will be upon the people of God. It's to see one another, even those who have been convicted of crimes, and to understand that we are not removed from them in the eyes of God. How we treat them, how we think of them, whether we stand up for their dignity or not, is the responsibility of all of God's people. And I think that's the call for us, to cry out, to plead for, and stand up for the innocent blood among us, so that their blood is not shed in our midst. It's a call for God's people to stand for justice until Jesus comes again. To stand for, especially for people in our midst who are disproportionately suspected of having committed crimes, those who are disproportionately convicted of having committed crimes that they may not have committed. Is to stand up for them, is to stand with them, is to cry out and plead for them, is to stand for justice, even for the people that are considered to be criminals in our midst. That is a high calling. And so let me encourage you this morning to think of the innocent blood among us, and to make sure to do everything in our power to make sure that their blood is not shed in our land.